Vinícius, pode começar.
Okay, so giving continuity to the presentation. So let's talk about model-based decisions and optimization procedures right now. Well, what are model-based decisions? They have then to select a strategy based on simulation results. It's that you take a decision, you make a decision based on the results of simulations, right? According to one or more objectives. So, as I said before, you can have different objectives. So you have to define what you want in the end of your process. You want to maximize production, you want to maximize profitability, you want to lower risk, you want to lower expenses. So you need to define what you want when you talk about to select a strategy or to take a decision, not necessarily the whole development plan. You take decisions all the time in the field life cycle. To close a well, to close the ICV, to change your life cycle. You're always taking decisions to implement a new technology, to reduce the rates. So what's your goal with that decision in that time, right? And these are complex tasks, a very complex task, right? And it's important to not oversimplify the process. You have to take into account a lot of stuff, like the fidelity of the simulation models you're going to use, if you're using more refined models that take more time to run or not, how you're going to do your data simulation process, how you deal with uncertainties, which methods of optimization you are going to use. So if you simplify all these things, you're not taking the best decision, right? Because you are talking about simulation. Simulation itself has already errors involved, right? It has medical errors and things like that. So if you simplify all these steps, the fidelity of the models, the data simulation process, the certainty assessment, the optimization, so the probability of having a suboptimal or bad decision is high, right? Since you're already using a tool that has errors involved, so let's do the best we can. Of course, the companies, they have a hurry to do the things, so sometimes they need to simplify the process because they have to produce, they have to follow the guidance and so on. But not us here, we can do more complete procedures. We can show that's better to not simplify the process, to do all the steps in the best way. So you try to do, using these tools that we have, the best things we can, right? Consider the best choice of all these examples here. I think Dennis already gave you in his class. These are just to remind a little bit. There's lots of ways to do model-based decision, right? The deterministic, probabilistic, open loop, closed loop. And here I focus more on our approaches here in the scene in our closed loop process. And there are several ways to do closed loop processes. And here in the scene, as Dennis presented, we have this procedure represented by this picture here, right? You have the just reminding quick. You have the green part where you choose the models. We first construct a high fidelity model, and depend on the study objective, we choose our simulation models, which is our grid and so on, or our so-called fit for purpose simulation models. Then we have the red part, that is the best part, which is the data simulation. So you have data, you can go to the big loop where you change our geological or high fidelity models, or if not, you go to changes in the fit for purpose models. And in the blue part, we have the the decision analysis and the selection production strategy. We have the long-term or the life cycle production optimization, right? So when you talk about selection production strategy, we're more related to this blue part here, is the long-term forecast, right? So, but of course, to do that, we need to pass through all this, right? If you don't have good models generated here in these green and red parts, you cannot make good forecasts, and hence you cannot make good decisions, right? So it's important to do the process entirely in a good manner, to have the best forecasts and the best decisions, because decisions are based on the forecasts, are based on the models. We have nowadays this black part, that is the short-term optimization. I'm not talk too much about that because it's recent. You have not too many people working on that yet, but you can have other possibilities. Instead of model-based decisions, you can have data-driven, machine learning, and things like that. So you can combine both techniques, the model-based and data-driven for instance, or machine learning, and this kind of thing for your short-term optimization, right? You can check if the long-term decisions are good in the short term, how to use the long-term controls to apply in the short term, and so on. But the thing here is that the blue part regards the life cycle optimization that you talk more here. And this picture is divided in 12 steps, right? As probably everybody knows already, the green steps, models calibration and generation, the green steps, the model construction, the red steps, the model calibration, data simulation, reduction of scenarios, and for us here, what is important is the blue steps, right? That is strategy selection for the base case and uncertainties. Of course, you go to step 9 and 10, that is the production strategy selection itself. You have to pass through reference models, initial risk analysis, right? The initial risk analysis I talked already a little bit, and I'll show for you the representative models to just define, just understand what is that, because you need that to talk about the production strategy selection under uncertainty. First of all, we have to define the objective, right? So we name this objective, quantify this objective inside an objective function. So the objective function is nothing more than a function that represents mathematically the overall objective of the project. And it's important to define the guideline for the production strategy selection or optimization. And it can be technical or economic indicators, or a combination, or multi-objective function. It could be a lot of things, right? Some examples of objective functions for deterministic case are NPV, NP, WP, recovery factor. For the probabilistic case are MEV, expected NP, risk indicator, and so on. It can be minimization of something as well. And it can be multiple objective functions, such as utility function or weighted objective function. That function of Susanna that I showed a few slides ago is kind of this weighted objective function that you have different weights in different functions combined all together, right? So define the representative models. The representative models, the objective of them is to represent the variability of the whole ensemble of models in a small number of simulation models. Why is that? The pictures, I guess it's clearer. We have first, when you generate multiple simulation models, have dozens or hundreds of models. The complete procedure would be optimize all of them, but this is impossible, right? It's unfeasible because it would take a long time. It would take too much computational effort, so it's not feasible. So the idea is to, inside this whole ensemble of simulation model, to select some of them to represent all of them, right? So we select some of this model to represent the availability of the uncertainties of all of them. And how to do that? There are several ways of the universities in the world that do differently, but in SIM we use a procedure that was implemented in this software, HemFinder. If anyone wants more information, you can check the papers of Meires, a professor from the Limeira campus, Unicamp campus of Limeira, right? So basically, to choose the representative models, we base our selection on 3 components. The first of them is risk curves, right? So in this example, we can have risk curves for several indicators. You can choose an NPV, core factor, WP, indicator for wells, economic indicator for wells, and so on. So here we have a risk curve. Each blue point is a uncertain scenario, the simulation model, and the red points are the representative models, right? And the idea here is to honor the whole curve. So the right points cannot be concentrated in only one part of the graph, such as here or here. They need to be distributed along the curve, right? They need to be honored for all the risk curves that we are considering. Of course, it's difficult to honor everything at the same time. So for some risk curves or some plots, the points are going to be more together or more separated, and so with that, you can give different weights. You can give more weight to NPV or to NP, and show some specific cross plots and so on. And the second component are the cross plots, that are graphs that correlate to indicators. For instance, NPV and our equilibrium factory, NP and WP, NPV and NP, and so on. And you have to have various points distributed, along this graph, right? It's important not to be concentrated in one part of the graph, but as I said, it's difficult to be perfect in all these graphs at the same time. So you have to choose some of them in relation to others. And another thing here is you have to honor the representative model. The RMs have to represent well the input distributions. So, for instance, if you have scalar uncertainties, for instance, you have uncertainties in PVT, you have 3 levels of PVT, 3 PVTs, PVT 1, 2, and 3. 1 have 50% of accuracy, and 2 and 3 have 25% of accuracy each one. So this percentage that appears in our whole ensemble, it has to appear also in our representative models, right? The distribution of the probabilities have to be the same in the representative models and in the whole ensemble of hundreds of models, right? Of course, again, it's difficult to honor everything at the same time, so it's expected there will be some difference here, but not to be very different. It's be similar, the output here and the inputs here, right? So I just defined up the REMs, the representative models, because we're talking about that in a few slides. When you talk about optimization processes, so optimization is nothing more than a maximization or minimization of the objective function that is represented by an indicator through changes in some variables, right? So the objective here is to find the best compromise among several requirements, and sometimes the requirements are conflicting, right? So it's important to define the objective. As I said, if you want to maximize recovery, to speed up recovery, to maximize economic return, to minimize risk, to minimize uncertainty, to minimize expenses, and so on. There are different ways to work with optimization. It can be manual, automatic, or assisted. It can be nominal or robust. So first of all, I want to talk about this topic and finding this. The manual optimization is when you go, the name says itself, right? You go through this, for instance, with the simulation. You want to find the best positions for the wells. You yourself go to the simulation file and do some changes manually and see what happens and test it then one by one and so on. The advantage of this is that you have more sensitivity of the problem. You have the experience of the professional working together to solve the problem. And the main disadvantage is the few options test, right? So you can have a suboptimal solution because your search space was reduced too much. You didn't test enough options and this kind of problems. And you have automatic or the optimization made by an algorithm, right? So you have lots of algorithms, and the main advantage is the increase in the search space, right? And so it's more likely to find an optimal solution. The disadvantage that the computational efforts, right, that many simulations are far from optimal solution. I mean, there are many useless simulations. Sometimes it takes too much time to go to the base case, then it proves the base case depending on the size of research space, and there is a lack of sensitivity of the sensitivity of the problem, right? Because you make it out automatically, so you put there, and if you put it there and just see the result afterwards, you lose some details, something that can happen in the model, and you lose this kind of sensitivity. You also have assisted optimization, right? It's kind of a combination of both manual and automatic optimizations, right? Assisted optimization is more like in workflow. Like you can use both manual and automatic, depending on the step of the process, right? In this kind, you can have an assisted workflow optimization, and in some steps you can use the manual, in some steps you can use the automatic, but which one you choose? There is no clear definition which type is better, right? Depends on your objectives, depends which search you have, if you have clusters or not, if you have good clusters, if you have only one machine, if you have your objectives, if you want a very precise result or not, if you want only an initial estimate, and depend on the stage of the process you are, then you are choosing that depending on what you're going to do and your researches available. Right now let's talk about the difference about nominal and robust optimization. First, talk about the nominal optimization. Nominal is what we used to call the deterministic optimization. Now we call nominal optimization to generate specialized strategies. I mean, in this kind of optimization, each RM is optimized separately. So, for instance, I have n RMs here. So RM1 be made one optimization. For RM2, I optimized, we made another optimization, and so on. Right? Each optimization, you give me one strategy and one associated NPV. Right? Afterwards, I simulate each strategy in the whole ensemble of uncertain scenarios, right? Generating any EMVs and then strategies, and then I select one of these strategies, right? The difference for that to the robust optimization is that in the robust optimization, the optimization is made once, so only one strategy is generated. So for instance, if I change a location of well, I change at the same time in all models, simulate all of them, and get an EMV direct, right? So here you have only one strategy generated, and in the other case here, we have n strategies. The advantage of doing this is that you have also more sensitivity to the problem. You can see the behavior of the fields for pessimistic scenarios, for optimistic scenarios. You can see how would be the strategy for pessimistic scenarios, how would be the strategy for optimistic scenarios, and how would be the best strategy in the average of the scenarios. In relation to this one, we don't have the sensitivity, right? Because you have only one good average strategy, right? This good average strategy will be suboptimal for each RM. Like, for instance, the optimized strategy for RM1 in the nominal optimization will be better, probably it will likely be better than this strategy in that RM. But in the average of the scenarios, this usually goes to a better result. But if you want to have more sensitivity to the scenarios, these ones has this advantage, right? Okay. So talk now about optimization variables. So when you're going to a problem to select a strategy, you need to define what you're going to optimize, what you need to optimize, and this decision you can have an sensitivity analysis first to see what's impacting your scenario, your strategy, and so on. But to do that, here in the scene we divided the variables in three main groups, right? This is a way to do it called hierarchical optimization, because if you optimize everything at the same time, it be lots of variables and many things happening all together, then you can have some problems. So it's good to divide in some steps, in some groups to have more detailed things of what you're doing, right? So G1 is the projection variables and is related to the development phase of the field. So when you're deciding the number of wells, when you're deciding the platform capacity, the well open schedule. So you have lots of uncertainty in this stage, and you have lots of flexibility as well, right? And these G1 variables impacts too much the objective function, main NPV, and so on. And this is important to be done in a proper way. And involves the higher expenses are related to G1, right? D2 is related to the management phase or the production phase, right? These are variables that can be changed in the daily basis and does not involve high extra expenses, right? except for some specific case, for instance, polymer fluids, and then you have cost for polymer. But in general, the control variables don't involve too much the extra costs, right? And nowadays divide these variables into groups, two subgroups. G2S are short-term control rules, and G2L are long-term control rules, right? So when close a well, when close a valve, I will apply a rule for the field life cycle, and then we're starting to study how this affects the short-term rules. How can we work with short-term, daily or monthly, and so on, control rules for well management, for injection, and so on. And some examples of G2 variables are production and injection rates, well shutting, control of ICVs, WAG cycle size, and so on. One thing to say here is that ICVs can be both G1 or G2, right? For instance, when you decide if you will have ICV, where you're going to start, which wells are going to have ICVs, the definition of the zones of the ICVs, then is G1, because you are going to pay for that yet. When the ICVs are already installed and the decision was already taken to have ICVs and you are going only to control them, then it's G2, right? Because it is only the control of that, when it is going to close, which which is the trigger to close the SCV, and so on. And finally, we have the G3, which means revitalization variables. These variables are related to the future alternatives in order to improve the future performance, and generally involve extra expenses. And the most common example is in field drilling, right? So after some years of reduction, you can shut in some wells that are not producing too much and drill another, or if you have slots enough, you can just drill another wells. You have some percent fields that are going to work into two waves or two phase. First, to put some wells initially in the field production and let some wells remain in the few years later. All right, there they call as waves, wave 1, wave 2. Here call as G3. And these are the optimization variables, but there are other variables that you can use to assist the optimization process. You are not going to optimize them because they are generally outputs for the simulator, from the simulator, but they can use to be a trigger to take some actions in your optimization. So this is the definition that I took from the agency guide, right? For the monitor variables. They represent reservoir, production, injection, all other measurements and sources of information are not subject to optimization, but are additional information for some objective functions, right? Also, the main uses are of monitor variable this. As a trick is to reactive or proactive actions, information to optimization process, and to reduce the search space. And some indicators that can be used as monitor variables are these. Long-term well economic indicators. These are like NPV for wells, similar to that. Can be water cut, GOR, and so on, NP, WP, water gas breakthrough. And how you use that? For instance, you can use the control rules to shut in wells or valves using water cut or GOR. For instance, when a well reaches some level of water cut, the well closes. So the optimization, the monitor variable is the water cut. So you don't optimize that because it's not the output of the simulator, right? You cannot change that. You don't have control of that. But you can use that to find a water cut limit to close a well. So your water cut limit is your optimization variable, while the water cut from the simulator is your monitor variable, right? It's kind of a little bit confusing, but who's working for that need to be aware, right? Another definitions here have different kind of controls, like proactive control or reactive control. There's some difference. People think different about this, right? But the most common definition of reactive controls is that to take the action after an undesirable event happens, right? So you take an action on the G2 variable when your monitor variable reaches a specific value after these events happen. While in the proactive control rule, you take an action before the undesirable event happens, right? So it's quite difficult to work a proactive rule because you have to act before the undesired event happens. For instance, you close an SCV on a producer before the water breakthrough. I think it's kind of difficult to convince a manager to do that, right? Because the event didn't happen yet. You're already closing SCV and possibly diminishing your production, just believing that you'll be best for the future. But then it's not easy to do that. You need to rely a lot in your process, in your results, and so on. But the examples of reactive control rules, the most common is what I said, in the the last slide. It's closing a well after reaching a specified GOR or water cut, or closing STV after reaching a specified GOR or water cut. It's important also to define is reactive or proactive in relation to what, right? Because sometimes you can have a rule that is reactive for something, but is proactive for other thing, right? And so you have to define reactive to what, to GOR, to water breakthrough, and so on. To negative cash flow, it can be proactive to negative cash flow, or reactive to other thing, and so on. I just talk fast here because probably Avance will give a lecture about this subject. Is the faster objective function estimator, the FOFS. The idea here is to discard bad solutions, to use faster models or other analytical solutions and so on to reduce the search space or to speed up the process. So this is one of the steps of the process. Will I use FOFs or not? I will use the complete model, the modified model, and so on. So it's one of the things that I have to decide in my optimization procedure, if I use fast models or not. For instance, here some examples of FOFs, the emulators, proxies that are analytical models. Now, fast simulation models, fully simulation models can be low fidelity models, or for instance, in C3 you have a giant field with 4 sectors, and you are working only with one sector, only one sector is developed, so you can use the isolated sector to accelerate the process, because the whole model takes 4 hours to run and the isolated model 40 minutes. So we use this isolated sector as a fast simulation model. This is an example of using a FOF. Of course, you can see if you can check. You need to check if the results are still viable, if you change too much. So you can use these in parts of the process, but it's important to go back and use the complete model, or a model for high fidelity again in the end of the process, right? But once you talk more about this, just to be aware that you have to be this, you need to have this in consideration when you're going to the optimization process. This is a table from one of the Nissin guides, but you're not going to details, but in relation to the fidelity of the models, we're talking about the fidelity in relation, generally related to the grid, right? So we have high fidelity models, medium fidelity models that we most used to run here in the low fidelity models, and have proxies, the fast simulations, emulators, combinations with physics-based and data-driven, combinations with physics-based and analytical. And just be aware that this exists and needs to be chosen when you're going to your optimization, if you want to use that or not, if it's possible to use that or not to speed up the process. But this subject will be talked about Avance in some seminar. Another thing that can be done is additional improvements. This is step 11 of the closed loop, right? So you can manage uncertainties in this step. How to do that? To take some other actions to diminish the uncertainty or to improve the performance of the field. And so you can work with the expected value of information. So you analyze if it worth to acquire more information, to acquire more seismic, to drill more wells in order to acquire information. That you call expected value of information. How much you will gain with this extra information, you'll be paid or not. Have some methodology to have the methodology of chance of success that we developed here, and show some ways to do that. You also have the expected value of flexibility. How much will I gain if I I make my strategy flexible, if I let space for do additional wells in the future, and so on. And also, as said in the beginning of the presentation, you can do in this step the integration production facilities to ensure that the reservoir solutions are compatible with the plans or existing production facilities. Of course, you can do that since the step 6 and do all integrated since step 6 until the final of the process, but that demands a high computational effort because it takes more time to run the simulations when you integrate. So the first step is to verify if we need or not to integrate in step 6 and so on. But if you go to step 11 and integrate production facilities and see that the results change too much, then you need to go back again and optimize new G1 or put new methods, some pumps or artificial lift, and re-optimize again, right? If this happens, so sometimes it's necessary to see to check the results if they are okay, and if they are not, to go back, optimize again, integrating with the production facilities. And this subject will be talked by João in more details. Another difference here is that regarding optimization algorithms and methods, right? The algorithm is that I said before, it's the definition of a process to maximize or minimize an objective function. It is one part of the method, right? The method is a more general term that includes more things. Includes the algorithm, includes which workflow I use, which steps are you doing manual or automatically. Sometimes I do only manual, I do not use algorithm, right? The search space is how you are defining my variables, the parameterization, will I use if office or not, will I work with robust or nominal optimization. All these definitions are included in the methods of the optimization. And one part of the method is the algorithm that can be the CMOS, this algorithm from CMOS, the DEC, or our methods here, ID, LHC, right? These two as the most used methods here in our group. So the two one that I will talk a little more later. As I said, you used to work with hierarchical optimization, dividing the variables into groups to facilitate the process and to save computational effort and so on. So this is an example of an workflow of an optimization process. So first you have initial estimates for number of wells, for positions, for the platform rates, right, limitations. Then you go to the optimization of the number of wells. Then you have initial estimates of development schedule, and then optimize all of these variables that was first an initial guess. Right? Then you analyze the results and go back again if necessary. If it's not necessary, you end your process. Right? This workflow suggested by Gaspar this year, and but each case, it's good to have a standard to work, but each problem has its own characteristics, its own specificities, and each person will work in some way, in different order, and so on. But this is a general workflow when I'm talking about hierarchical optimization. Some examples of optimization algorithms, the CMOS has this you know how to say this DC algorithm. It's an iterative optimization, and it applies these two steps, right? These two stages: the design exploration, that you test is a lot of things and it discards the bad alternatives, and the control evolution, that is improving the solution along the time, and go back to the first stage to check if some discarded solutions needs to be discarded or not. That's why this is continued here, because the algorithm tests against some discarded possibilities. One disadvantage of this methods that takes too many simulation runs to achieve a good result, right? It's not, if we think after some works we had here, it's not the most efficient method. Maybe change the parameterization, we can improve that. But sometimes, for instance, you have a base case here, and it took hundreds or thousands simulations to reach the base case, and then a few simulations to get values better than the base case. Of course, sometimes the parameterization is not good, but in general, you see that this happens in this algorithm from CMOS. You have another algorithm here. It was for IG-LHC, Iterative Discrete Lighting Hypercube. It was firstly developed for data simulation, for history meshing, and then João adapted for optimization purposes, right? Is a method based on the discrete Latin hypercube that is a sampling statistical method, right? And is dividing in iterations, reducing the search space over the time, right, in each iteration. And the main focus the proper treatment of the posterior frequency distributions of the discrete variable levels. Quite confusing, right? But I will explain better some examples soon. Just to show here an example of an optimization, the comparison of CMOS DC, this from these papers of João. So in the dashed line here, you have the result from CMOS, and you have in 9 iterations, you have a convergence for the optimization, and the result better than CMOS, a little better than CMOS in fewer simulations, right? I don't know if the picture is from the same case here, the same paper, but maybe it's the same case. But if it is, it took it here 3,000 simulations and here 900 simulations, and achieved the best result. So we are using more in our group this algorithm than CMOS, I think, and you had some problems with CMOS in the cluster, right, and etc. That's why you are using more this method. And of course, as it's implemented in our softwares here, you have more control and we understand better what's happening. And it's a good algorithm to use for optimization. We tested already in G1 variables, in G2 variables, and worked well for both variables. Of course, there is still improvements to be made in this algorithm, but you know, it's working good. You can see each color here is an iteration. And it's reducing the search space over the time along the iterations, as we can see in this picture here. Have here the example of 4 iterations. We have this variable, I think is the water injection for the platform. Initially, you have 12 levels for this variable, right, in uniform distribution here. And then as you go further into optimization, in the 9th iteration, you have only 2 levels, only levels 5 and 6, right? So the algorithm discarded all other levels and find the best combinations are using only these two levels, right? And just to explain better how it works, this algorithm, let's exemplify here with 3 variables. So let's say you have 3 variables A, B, and C with uniform distribution each one. So we have 5 levels for each variables in this example, and each level has a probability of occurrence of 20%. That is my frequency of occurrence of each level for each variable. Okay, so the algorithm will be combinations. You say to the algorithm how many combinations you want. You want any combinations. Let's say you want the method to sample 100 combinations. So for each iteration, the algorithm will make 100 combinations and sample 100 combinations that will be resulted in 100 simulation models, right? So 100 combinations, 100 samples, 100 simulation models. So in this example, if I have 100 combinations, I have 100 simulation models, I have 100 NPVs, right? Then I choose a threshold cut. For instance, I choose 30%. So from my 100 NPVs, the algorithm will choose, will take into account the 30% better. So the 30 best NPVs, the levels that result in the 30 best NPVs will be taken into account to sample again my variables in my combinations in my next iteration, right? So let's say we choose, you have the variables, we have the levels in the form distribution, a sample that n times have n NPVs. I chose a specific percentage of the NPVs to be followed in the next iterations. So let's say that happened. Variable now the second iteration has the red bars here as the frequency occurrence, as probability of occurrence. Probability no, as frequency, right? So this is my new sampling levels in this new iteration. So in the second iteration, the sampling, you consider this level. So my variable A, you have 60% of the samples, you have the level 5 for variable A, and only 10% of level 2 for variable A will be shown in the combinations. The same for variable C. For variable C, level 1 and level 2 will not appear anymore. Level 3 appear 30% of the times. Level 5 appear 10% of the times. Variable C appears 6% of the time, and so on. And the algorithm will combine that, and the process will be repeated. So we generated 100 simulation models, 100 NPVs, the 30% of NPVs, and this is reducing over their time. Okay. Just to try to explain how these two main algorithms that we use in our group works. As I said, it's important to define objectivity because some objectives are conflicting. For instance, increase profitability and decrease risk. Sometimes it's difficult to do both at the same time. Sometimes to increase profitability, you have to increase risk. You have to spend more money, have to drill more wells, and so on. So increase your risk. Sometimes what you expect to happen not happens, right? And to talk here also that not necessarily higher production means higher economic return. It's necessary to take the costs into account. Right, so you have this example, but in this example, you have higher NPVs, if not the best NPVs, but is there a kind of correlation? I have another example here that's more clear to show this kind of issue. I have an optimization process divided in some steps. This is from my thesis, my PhD thesis. So we have some steps in our nominal optimization, right? One of the steps regards the removal of the wells. You see here that you have here the recovery factor, you have here the NPV. As is the first one of the first steps, have negative values here, right? But just to have the initial estimates. You see here that you have more production if you much lower NPV, right? Because you have much more wells than I needed. The wells were not being efficient. So what's better? Produce less, then produce more and spend more money and recover more money, right? Have a lower economic return. So you need to be attention. Not necessarily higher recovery means higher higher recovery means a higher economic return. But this will depend if in your step of the optimization method, you are changing your investments or not. But in these steps, the investments vary and is dependent and are dependent on the number of wells. That's why there is no correlation between recovery factor and NPV. These following steps is the same thing. These addition of wells, these are made manually. For instance, these are made automatically with algorithm. So you see here much higher production for these possibilities of strategies, but if much lower NPV, right? So you have here much more economic return if lower production. Because why is that? Because in this step the investments also vary among each simulation. Each point here is a simulation, it's a different strategy, right? So the investments here vary in this dependence on the number of wells, right? Probably here I had more wells drilled, but they're not being efficient, right? Because I was spending money that was not enough to be recovered by the extra oil that I was producing. So it's better produce menos, drill less wells, and recover more money and get more money. And this type of investment vary, and that's why there's no correlation between economic return and recovery factor. But if there is the investments do not vary too much in the step of the procedure, then you can say that you can have a strong correlation between the production and the NPV or the economic return. So you can see here, of course, you have some values of a higher NPV, lower NPVs, but the difference is small here, right? So you can say that you have a strong correlation, and thus you have more produced oil, you also have more economic return. Because here the wells are already set, the location of the wells are already already defined. So the investments do not vary in each point here. So we have this correlation. So in the management phase or the production phase, this is a thing that we can care less than in the development phase, right? Because generally in the production or the management phase, you don't have too many extra costs or extra expenses, so you can say that the NPV is very correlated to production, to recovery factor. And also you can combine, you can use indicator that combine both, right? You can use in your optimization as objective function, a function that combines NPV and recovery factor, for instance. But I think the best indicator is NPV because it already takes consideration the recovery, it takes consideration the speed of recovery because you brought it to the present date. So the anticipation of recovery is taken into account in NPV when using NPV as indicator. You take into account the costs, for instance, in the polymer flooding project that we worked. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, we had some cases that you have too much higher production with polymer flooding, but when you go to the economic analysis, the NPV was lower than water flooding in some nominal cases, right? And that's because I was spending too much money in polymer flooding. There were cases when I injected too much polymer and it was not good for the economics of the project, right? It was good for the recovery and was not good for the economics. So you have to decide objective and what you want. You want the best recovery as you can because of some regulations, some contracts, or you want the maximum economic return. So to define the objective and to work with that is part to have in mind. The second steps this may not vary, so there's strong correlation between PV and NPV or recovery factor. Some support tools for strategy selection that can be used mainly for a nominal case. Quality maps. Quality maps are some maps that can be used to find the best positions to locate wells. You can use to reduce the search space, for instance, or to do manual optimization. So there are lots of ways to construct quality maps. You have some dissertations and papers in our group that work with that. But basically, you have a map with some quality index, and you can position the well in the areas that are most likely to have the better production, right? It's not certain that you have, but it's more likely to have these areas. And there are lots of ways to construct that. You can combine some parameters of permeability and oil saturation. You can use this in a simplified way. Just use the oil saturation per area in the end of the simulation as a simplified quality map. The newer versions of CIMIG, you have the oil potential that is kind of a quality map that shows the potential to produce oil in some regions. It's already output for CIMIG simulators. You can use that as a quality map, for instance. And also we have the streamlines. You can use the streamlines to see how is the flow inside the reservoir, right? In different times, for instance, you can see it's important to control use optimization, right? You can see where the water or the gas is coming from, which injector is influencing each producer. The water is coming from each injector, the gas is coming from each injector, so it can help the optimization of valves, of work cycles, for instance. You can use for some studies, right? Let's talk a little bit about the physical systems, because the physical system can influence the production strategy selection, as you see in a few slides. And Johnston said in 1994 there are more tax systems for oil in the world than number of countries, because each country has one or more fiscal system, right? For instance, in Brazil, you have two, basically two. You have the concession regime for post-salt fields and the production sharing regime for pre-salt fields. And each country has one or more than one, and has his own taxes, his own fees, and his own regulations, right? But in general, we have this scheme for the fiscal regimes around the world. We have the oil tax regimes on the top of the scheme here, and it's basically divided into systems: the contract systems and the concession systems. The concession systems are also called as royalty and tax system, or RT system. So this is how you call RT system and contract system. The contract system is divided in other ones, right? In production share contracts, like in pre-salt here, PSC, and service contracts that are used in other countries, and so on. And also, service contracts is divided into two types of service contracts: pure service or risk service. And in Brazil, you have these two, right? So the RT for post-salt fields, and production share for the pre-salt fields. There are a lot of discussions which is better for the companies or for the governments, and a lot of discussions to change that or not, and so on. But let's see a little bit the difference among them. The RT system, or the concession system, the ownership of the natural resource is the company, right? So the parent company has the rights of ownership of a natural resource. So it has the concessionary, or the company obtains the right to explore and produce the oil that's underground the country, and holds the right to the oil after the payment of the taxes and the fees and all the things that they have to pay. All right, in some examples of countries that use this system: Morocco, New Zealand, Colombia, Netherlands, Brazil, United States, and many other marks. But in the contract system, the difference that the government remains the owner of the natural resource after its production, right? It's not the company. And in the production sharing contracts, the company generally receives part of the oil production. You receive the rights to that oil. That's the main difference between production sharing, like as here, and the service contracts. In service contracts, the company receives part of the profit in cash and not in production. And the production share, it receives in oil. It discounts some expenses, the oil costs, and after some calculations, part of the oil goes to the government, and part of the oil goes to the company. Some examples here: Indonesia have Santa Mango, the reference a little old. I don't know if nowadays it's still like this. 85% was to the government, and 15% for the company. And other countries that using this type of contract systems: Angola, Libya, Tanzania, Bolivia, Mozambique, Turkey, Ecuador, China, India, Nigeria, Trinidad and Tobago, Brazil, and so on. And as I said, in the service contract, the company receives part of the profit in cash, not in production, like the production sharing contract. And in the pure service contract, the company is remunerated for the provided service, right? And assuming all the risks involved, and it holds all the natural research discovered and produced. Example, cultures in the Middle East. And in the risk service contracts, the payments of the services is made based on the profits, right? So it's no oil found, then the company receives nothing, right? All the risks are go to the company. It's very similar, both, but this one, the company's contract to provide the service and is remunerated to that, right? But in the risk service, the remuneration varies related to the profit. Here's a table of an example of changes in the government share and the company share for some countries. Here's just a cross who has some curiosity to see this. It can be some more details in the dissertation of Livia. You have in yellow the concession regime, in red the service contract, and in blue the production sharing. You have a lot of changes around the time, and change in difference in different countries, going from almost everything to the government, from not too much to the government and the government share, and so on. But the question that you have to make in this context, the context of this presentation, is that does the fiscal system affect the production strategy selection? If I have to take into account the system, if its concession is one strategy that I select, if its production share is another strategy, I have some conclusions from the work, the Livia works. She made her dissertation here in UNICUP and made a very good study regarding this subject. Basically, she optimized the strategy under these two different fiscal systems, and she found some conclusions. That one of the first conclusions that the configuration, the operation configuration of the production strategy does not differ too much when the optimistic economic scenarios are considered. So for higher oil prices, for instance, when I consider scenarios of higher price, optimistic scenarios, the strategy for both systems do not change too much. Both systems, I mean, production sharing and concession system, RT and PSC system, right? That are the two systems that we have here in Brazil. However, when facing economically unfavorable scenarios, or when you're facing pessimistic economic scenarios, cases recurred because there are some difference in the strategies to produce, and depending on the scenario, it's better for both the company and government not produce, depending on the fiscal terms involved. For instance, in fields with low oil volume, for fields with low oil volume, another conclusion that she took from her study is that it is an advantage for the government to develop the fields under the production share regime, right, for more optimistic economic scenarios. However, in more pessimistic scenarios, for fields with low oil volume, the production becomes economically viable only under concession regime, and it's unfair for both governments and the company if the tax regime is to share production, right? So in this specific case, that is lower production, lower price, sometimes it's better, and if it's to production sharing, it's better not to develop the field. But if it's concession, it's okay to develop because it will be economically viable. We are talking about both government and company, right? So just to highlight that depends on the case, depends on the situation, depends on the price of the oil that you're considering, that you can change or not the decision to cover the how to recover the well, right? Depends on the type of the field, the volume of oil of the field. You can have some difference. These differences are lower for optimistic scenarios, right? The strategies don't differ too much for higher prices, but for lower prices, then you can need to take care mainly for periods of lower oil production. And finally, the last subject I talk here in this presentation is regarding the benchmarks. Benchmarks are available simulation models to compare and validate methodologies. Have some classic benchmarks like SP10 that was used in many works. You have Norne, that's real benchmark for real data. You have Brugge, that is another international benchmark. But here I'll talk about synthetic benchmarks that we work here in Unisym. In Unisym, benchmarks, we use the reference model substituting the real reservoir, right? So we try to emulate the response of the applications in the real case, right? Because when you are in the field, you develop some methodology or something to apply, you apply in the field, but you don't know if that works or not. When you go to our benchmarks, you can verify if the methodology works or not. You can ask the case is the same for everybody. You can compare methodologies, different methodologies. All these conditions will be the same. You can compare methodologies for different research groups. And you can verify if the methodologies work in the real case or not, because we have this reference model that will explain how it works now. For instance, I have here a benchmark. This is Saquan, is not a provided benchmark in the website, but using here as example because all our benchmarks works in a similar way. I have a reference model. Reference model is a high fidelity model, very refined simulation model. It's our real response, it's our true models, our nature, right? And you have the cursor simulation models, and you have our uncertainties, and you have a cursor grid, and so on. So the reference model is very refined, and our true model is like the real field. It's like we didn't know the answer of that model besides you construct that, but it's like we didn't know because it's a real case. You don't know what will happen in the future, but it's a controlled environment. Then we can know, because you simulate that, we can know what would be the answer in a real case. And also use the reference model to extract field data. Like the real case, they extract your log, they have history data, they have seismic data. You can do that synthetically, right? You generate synthetic real logs, synthetic history data, synthetic seismic data. We're also using this reference case what we call the unmapped properties, the famous that no one knows, right? To be this more like more similar to your case, some unexpected uncertainties that was not expecting to appear. So, for instance, in this model, you have fractures along the faults that exists only in the reference case, and they were not mapped in the simulation models because you consider as economic nodes. We didn't know that it was there, but it was to see how it will affect my methodology and my strategy and so on. So the main thing here is that we use this to emulate challenges and difficulties for the real case, but inside a controlled environment, and see the applicability of the methodologies in a real case, right? So how you generate a static case? You have the reference model with a finding grid. You generate synthetic profiles. You combine with all other uncertainties. You generate images and combine with other uncertainties and generate the multiple simulation models, as I said before in the beginning of this presentation. So, but here is not your case. This is a synthetic case. From this, you have history data. These are the results directly from the simulation for the reference case, but we add some noise here to emulate real circumstances, right? Because the measurements of the data are not very precise, not like this. So we add some noise here to have more realistic data. And you can have Gaussian saturation to generate for the seismic data. I think Alessandro will give you some lecture regarding this subject in the next few weeks. Here nowadays you have three benchmarks in UC. UC 1 is the most used and the oldest one is the benchmark of characteristics of number of the field. Here are some characteristics of the model, and have four cases, the reference case that I said, and regarding the simulation models, we have three cases. That this case differs, not the geology and all of that, depends on the stage of the development of the field. So in C1D is the benchmark for the development phase studies. In C1M is the benchmark for the management phase studies, and in C1H is the benchmark for data simulation studies. What differ among them is the date, right? And the stretch until that date. And dates, not data, right? For instance, for C1D, you are in a date earlier than on C1M and on C1H. So we don't have a complete strategy. You have only 4 wells that the appraisal which are the appraisal wells and so on. But for on the C1M and the C1H, we have already in a production strategy. We have already these wells drilled, so we cannot alter anymore. So it's more focused for management or production phase studies, right? So as I said, we have different scales, simulation model. Here are some characteristics of the model. The simulation model takes 90 minutes to run. The first case takes a few days to run. It's a very fast model comparing to the models that we have nowadays. That's very big models take hours to run the simulation model and a month to run the reference case. And this case is available in the site, right, website. I have also NISTIN 2, that's a synthetic carbonates fracture field. It's a dual perm model, and have some characteristics of some pre-salt fields. And similar to NISTIN 1, you have NISTIN 2R, NISTIN 2D, NISTIN 2M, NISTIN 2H, depending on the development phase of the field, right? So this is modest challenge for data simulation, even for product structure selection, because many fractures, the structure of the field is challenging, and so there are super case and so on. And nowadays also, some weeks ago, I guess, we released the NISTIN 3. That is a karstic and giant reservoir model of Brazilian pre-salt characteristic. It's based on a specific pre-salt field that I think I cannot say the name, and in this case, you change a little bit the nomenclature. You're not using anymore NISTIN 3M or H. You link the to a date, right? So we have NISTIN 3 2018, you have NISTIN 3 2022. And this model is available in this website. The difference between these two cases is the date and the stage of development, of course. So we have in NISTIN 3 2018, and projecting the initial stage of the field development, we have only producing an extended test, teste de longa duração, right? That is producing and injecting for 1 year, right? Showing this graph. You have other more wells that are used in the modeling, but you consider that appraisal wells. They are not producing in this date yet. Right, so we have here in this case just this data, just the rates for these two wells, and the whole development of this model can be made for all sectors. For let's say this is a giant model. The main challenge of this model is the size of it, because it takes too long to run. So it's divided in four sectors, but there is communication between the sectors. The division only represents the the production of one platform represents the production for one production system. So each sector here will be developed by one production system, one platform, and we're divided more or less by the same oil volume, right? So in Syntri 2002, you have in sector 1 the strategy already developed. As I said, you have here 2 waves like companies do. We have here developed in Syntri 2002 the first wave of sector 1. We have another well in sector 2, but it's appraisal well. It's not producing yet in this date, in 2022. So this benchmark can be used for management studies in sector 1 and development studies in other sectors, right? So it's very interesting to be used because it can be used for both type of studies. So we have the production data for the field of all of these wells, including the extended well test, right? You have the EWT in the first period, then have a stop in production, then you have that build-up phase that I talked earlier, and you have here the plateau phase. You have already implemented here some stops in production during the history phase. To be more realistic, because in real world, the companies do lots of stops for maintenance or other things or problems. It's much common to have stops. So implement the history period to have a more realistic case, and that's why there are these decreases in the production in this beginning of the life of the field. So this benchmark can be used for well cycles optimization, for SCV study. Another characteristic of this model is that there is high CO2 content. So is that case if the bottleneck of gas production. So it can be used for HACCP studies, for SCV study, well injection studies, and also for development of these other sectors. How to do the development considering the other sectors? Can I isolate the model and not how to speed up the process? Because if I apply the whole closed loop in this model, each simulation takes 4 hours. It takes too many computational efforts, right? So the main challenge here is how to work with a field with the size and apply the procedures, how to improve the procedures to apply in a field of this size. So that's what I want to show you. If you have some questions, you can ask. And thank you very much.
Any questions to Vinicius?